Once upon a time, back in the mid-1990s, as I was walking through the fantasy section of my bookstore, I noticed something. There were some books that were coming out by a man named Robert Jordan. It was called The Wheel of Time. And I picked up book one, and I looked at it, and it looked interesting, but for some reason I put it back down. Fast forward about 30 years into the future, and I've read the series. And today I want to share with you some reasons why I think this series might be for you, and some reasons why I think this series might not be for you. Let's zoom in on the books. And now let's roll the intro. Hey, welcome back to BellTube, everyone. I'm Brian Bell. Today we are talking about The Wheel of Time. No, not the television program, the books. And I wanted to share with you some reasons, and I haven't talked about The Wheel of Time on the channel yet, but I wanted to share some reasons with you why I think this series is worth your time and why I think this series may not be exactly what you're looking for. And in typical fashion, as we do here on the channel, I'm going to start off with kind of the bad news first. I'm a person that if somebody says to me, Brian, I've got good news and bad news, I generally ask them to start with the bad news first to get that out of the way. Then we can explore the good stuff. So let's talk about some pros and cons of The Wheel of Time, the book series, and we're going to start off with the cons. The first big con of reading this story is sort of an obvious one. It's a humongous series. There are 4.4 million words in this series. It is a TBR killer. If you are not going to spread this out over a very long period of time, and I'm going to share with you here in a few minutes why I think that that's a challenge to do, even though many have done it, it really can be a TBR killer. So if you are looking at your TBR list and you've got a lot of books that you're really excited to read, to insert The Wheel of Time into that really is going to cripple a lot of the opportunity for a lot of the other books. They're not short books. Even the shortest of them are probably longer than most of the books on your TBR. So it's going to take some doing, and that's worth thinking about. It's worth considering if you're going to contemplate reading these books. And really depending on how you read in general, like for me, I'm going to give you an example. I read this in 2021. You know, there was something kind of going on in the world at that time, so I had ample time to read this series, and I pretty much read it straight through for a period of about 4 months, so it kind of worked for me that way. But if you were going to read this over time, let's say you were going to pick, 3 or 4 years and you wanted to get through The Wheel of Time, what I think is important to understand is that sometimes our own personal motivations change and our life changes as we move through the years. So what you may start with great intentions today, if you decide to put this series on kind of a long track to do, you might not feel the same way that you do today 3 or 4 years from now. So it's something to bear in mind. Another con that I think I should be straightforward about this series is there are some elements to it that are a bit outdated. Now, if you know me at all and you've been on the channel, nothing is really off limits. I don't care really what the personality of the author was. If the work is good, the work is good. But there are some elements that are a little kind of sketch. Maybe. Without spoiling too much, there's a little bit of a harem element to some of the romance side of things. Now, again, that can be construed as either kind of regressive or progressive. Regressively, yes, a harem element is a little male fantasy oriented, and that's probably not very mainstream today. On the other hand, if you get into alternative lifestyles and you start talking about the poly world and things like that, then this might make some sense where you've got a character that is involved in a relationship with many different other people, and those people each bring something unique to the relationship. There are arguments for and against that, but just to kind of let you know up front, that is an element in The Wheel of Time, and it's something that I think you ought to be prepared for either way, whether you love that kind of thing or whether you really dislike it, especially if you dislike it because it doesn't happen right away, and you're going to find yourself very invested in the series by the time that happens. So alternative lifestyles might kind of be fun to read about if that's your jam. I don't know. It's got to be the king. Let's move on. Another con about the Wheel of Time for me is that because this book series is so long, and because there's so many different factions and elements happening, I felt as a reader sometimes that the author wasn't entirely sure where he was going. And I'm primarily talking about the Robert Jordan books, and of course we'll get to the Brandon Sanderson books, in a little bit here. But there were plenty of times that I remember putting the book down for the day saying, where is Jordan going with this? Because I'm not sure. I just read 150 pages. Nothing substantial really happened. And I feel like whatever I just read isn't that critical to where we're going. So I kind of felt a little lost in the series, and not in the way that it was just a trust the narrator or trust the author type of a way. I started to doubt whether he knew where he was going, and that was kind of around about 6, book 7, something like that. So again, keep that in mind. And speaking of people who don't know exactly where they're headed, if you would like to help them along their journey to find BellTube, all you need to do is like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that post notification bell so you never miss a video. All of those things help new people find this channel, and we can grow our community, and I really appreciate it and want to say thank you in advance if you choose to do so. Another con of this series for me is that there are a lot of POVs, and in and of itself, that's not so much a con. A Song of Ice and Fire also has a lot of POVs, and I really gravitated to almost all of them. However, there were several POVs in the Wheel of Time that I did not care for at all, and Robert Jordan was not known for his brevity. There are very long POV chapters that seemed like a drag to me. Now, if they happen to be characters that you love, you're going to really like that a lot. But in my case, some of those POV chapters just went on too long, and it became kind of a snooze fest for me. It's just something to bear in mind. The same kind of goes with the prologues at the beginning of each book. I want to say some of the books have prologues that are approaching 50, 60, 70 pages long. And the challenge that I found was that not everything that happened in those prologues was relevant, even though they're extremely detailed. There's names, there's places, there's histories, and all of this is going on, and I'm trying to think to myself, Brian, do I really need to know this as I move through the book? And one would think that you do, but what I found is in many cases, those prologues were just backstory and weren't entirely relevant to where the story was going, or if they were, they certainly could have been wrapped up in 10 or 12 pages. They did not require 50 or 60 of them, so that's something to bear in mind. Another thing that you're going to hear about the Wheel of Time is that at times it feels bloated, where the writing just seems to go on and on and on, and nothing really happens. It's not so much personal development stuff. It's like filling words into a page. I strongly believe that these books could have been edited down a bit more than they were. That said, it is what it is. Be prepared for it. There are going to be times where the series feels bloated. It's just the nature of the beast. We're talking about a huge series. Some parts of it are going to be more action-packed, or they're going to be more character development parts of the book that are important, and some of them are going to be talking about what the women are wearing, and that's going to go on for 7 or 8 pages. So just be aware of it. There are sections that are bloated. The final thing that I want to talk about as it relates to cons of reading The Wheel of Time is the amount of books it really takes to decide if this series is for you. It changes quite a bit. Book 1 is sort of standard adventure story fare, where you got the guy who's coming off the farm in the small village and they're going on a quest and they're doing all these things. You've read about it before. It's kind of standard fantasy fare. Book 2 really takes a different direction. The adventure gets better. The plot gets more narrowed in scope to very specifically the Wheel of Time and not so much a generic adventure. The Great Hunt for me is one of the best books in the entire series. But I really believe this series takes 4 books to decide if it's for you or not. And that's a lot of pages. So it's something to be aware of. If I was going to start this series again, I would say I'm giving it at least 4 books. And I think books 1, 2, 3, and 4 will give you enough information to know what you need to know if this is going to be a series for you or not. Nothing tremendously different happens after book 4, in my opinion. There are some excellent books after book 4. There are some kind of not great books after book 4. But I think that's enough. That's where I would stop and evaluate, do I want to continue? All right, we've talked about some of the negative stuff. We wanted to get the bad news out of the way so we can get to the good news. And there is a lot to love in the Wheel of Time. For one, the prose, and I mean it both ways, the prose of the pros and cons, and prose in the literary sense of it, is quite good. Robert Jordan is extremely descriptive. Some may say he's a little overly descriptive at times, but I found that it was a real compelling read for me, both in character descriptions and the world building itself is second to none. There are different continents, there are different countries and leaders and kings and monarchs and rulers and histories. The richness of this world and the lore that we get with the Wheel of Time is pretty unparalleled. He sets the bar very high. If you are an avid fantasy reader, world building in the Wheel of Time is not something you're ever going to say, well, Jordan didn't do a very good job world building. It is a huge pro in the pro column for reading the Wheel of Time series. Let's talk about the magic system for a moment. Now, it's a little bit strange in that we've got a feminine side of the magic and a masculine side of the magic, and they shall never cross, or men can't do it at all. I'm not going to spoil it at all. One of the neatest parts about the magic system is that within the Aes Sedai, which are the group of women who are basically magicians and who can control the magic in the world, there are various factions that are essentially divided up by color, and those colors all have different specialties. It makes for a compelling story because you know if somebody's from a particular faction, what type of magic they're most capable of wielding. It really drew me in. I loved the different factions within it. It's an interesting system also because you'll find that these different factions have different politics within them. Some seem extremely friendly, although they may not be. Some seem extremely controversial and very adversarial, although some members may not be. It does trick you a little bit, but it is a pretty neat way of dividing up how the different magic works. I would put it in the pro category for reading the series. One of the concepts that I love so much about this is that the Wheel of Time is essentially a wheel. And while the wheel turns, things come around again. And that's really kind of the premise of this entire story with the lore, not getting into any spoilers, but it's something that I have a personal great belief in. I'm a big fan of the Dark Tower series by Stephen King, and he talks quite a bit about Ka is a wheel. And if you've read the Dark Tower, you know what I'm talking about. I read the Dark Tower before I read the Wheel of Time, and I kept coming back to that thought that Ka is a wheel. And I think when you get into this series, you're going to understand a little bit more about what I'm talking about. But the concept of things coming around again and repeating until we get it right is something of great interest to me. It's almost kind of like a karmic concept in some degree, but not exactly. It's a little bit hard to describe again without spoilers, but just in general, take it from me that the wheel concept of the Wheel of Time is a pro for reading this series. Another pro for reading the series is there's no great adaptation. Now, I just finished reading the book Shogun by James Clavell, and as it happens, there is an incredible adaptation right now on TV. There was also an incredible adaptation back in the 1980s. As you may or may not be aware, there is an adaptation on Prime Network of The Wheel of Time, and it is certainly not entirely faithful to the series, and I don't think you can substitute at all the books of the series for that TV show. It's an adaptation, it's not very close. It's not like Shogun, where if you decided you didn't feel like reading the 1,300-page book, that you could get the gist of it by watching this incredible miniseries. It is not close at all. There is no good adaptation. If you want the true story of the Wheel of Time, you have to read the series. Another pro for reading this series, it's a tremendous adventure story. And if you are somebody like me who really wants to see the hero's journey from start to finish, that's what you get with the Wheel of Time. Yes, there's lots of twists and turns. Yes, some of them may or may not be necessary. But at the end of the day, the adventure told within the Wheel of Time, I think, captures the imaginations of most of the people who read it, and in fact, that's why we're drawn to fantasy. A tremendous adventure story, another great pro for reading the series. Another pro for reading the series, I am not what you call a resume reader. And what I mean by that is that if you want to be called a quote-unquote fantasy fan or somebody who's really knowledgeable in the genre, that you have to have read certain materials. I don't believe that at all. You can read whatever you want, and you should read whatever you want. All of that said, it does add a little bit of credibility when you're talking about fantasy works if you've read the entire Wheel of Time. It just gives you a little bit more knowledge of the genre as a whole because it is such a huge seminal work. You don't need to read any resume books, and that does include The Lord of the Rings, by the way. If The Lord of the Rings isn't your jam, then don't read it. But again, I don't think you could find anybody that would say, well, you're worse off in your fantasy knowledge from having read Wheel of Time. And as we've talked about on the channel before, who cares what other people think? They're just their opinions. It doesn't matter. But for your own personal feeling of credibility, you might find it useful. If you do, it's a pro for reading the series. So when we're talking about pros and cons of the Wheel of Time, I bet most of you are surprised that I didn't talk about the slog in the cons section or a reason not to read it. In fact, I think quite the opposite. I think the slog is exactly why you read something like the Wheel of Time. Why? Because we can take a fantasy adventure and bring it past the fourth wall into kind of a meta level. The slog, if you're unaware, is kind of like books 7 through 10 or 7 through 9, something like that. And it's a series of books that are well known to be kind of go nowhere books, move very slow. They call it the slog because you gotta get through it to get to the rest of the good stuff. But the truth is this, we read fantasy literature because we want to read adventures, and adventures would be completely boring if every page something better happened than the last page, right? We want to see conflict, we want to see drama, we want to see our heroes go through difficult times. And for me, the slog brings that out into the meta level where we as readers join along with our adventuring party through a difficult part of the story. I think it's a cool thing to do. I don't know that there's many people that look at the slog the same way that I do, but on the meta level, when you get through the slog, I remember reading Knife of Dreams, which is the first book, which I think is probably considered after the slog, or the first book that happens after the slog. When I got through Wheel of Dreams, I was so excited because once again, I was reading a book in the Wheel of Time that I completely loved. But if not for the slog, my affection for Knife of Dreams wouldn't have been what it is. I was so appreciative of it, and looking at it on a meta level, it's kind of fun to go through the slog, at least it was for me, along with our heroes. Something to consider. I consider it a pro, not a con. As many of you know, Robert Jordan didn't live to finish off this series, and Brandon Sanderson actually wrote the last 3 books using the notes that Robert Jordan had, and his editor, his wife, contributed as well. And Brandon Sanderson wrote the last 3 books, and I really believe that they are excellent. So we are talking about a 14-book series, 15 if you include the prequel, and that takes commitment. And for me, that is a pro for reading this story, and it brings us into our one for the road today, and that is about commitment. If you're going to do the Wheel of Time, it is a commitment on your part. And if you're not very good at keeping commitments, it's an excellent way of forcing yourself to do it. Now, I always talk about my personal life here when we do these one for the roads because I feel like it might be a little bit more impactful and meaningful for you guys to know how something like commitment has worked or not worked for me. Look, I've gone through a big portion of my life with some sort of a hidden, maybe hesitation. I'm not sure it's fear, but certainly a hesitation of some big commitments. And the actions that we take that force us into commitments help to try to strengthen our ability to deal with making commitments and deal with, in my case, the thought of making a commitment. Because I find in many times the thought of committing is actually harder for me than actually committing in the first place. And One for the Road here is all about, if I'm going to do the Wheel of Time, let's make a commitment to do the Wheel of Time. Let's at least make a commitment to do the first 4 books. If I don't like it there, I can listen to what Brian said and say, hey, you know what? I can DNF it. And of course, you can DNF it at book 1 if you like. I just don't think you're giving it a fair shake. In totality, do I recommend the Wheel of Time to people? Yes, if the pros in this video outweighed the cons for you. If it did, I highly encourage you to pick up Eye of the World. I would probably do this as an iRead for your first read rather than Audible if that can work for you. The reason being, there are thousands of named characters, and I think doing it on Audible might be a little challenging for a first read, but I know plenty of people who have done it. It can be done. So however you consume the series, as long as you're enjoying it, that's what works for me. Let's try to spread some positivity out in the world today. If you want to know, by the way, where the Wheel of Time falls within my top fantasy lists, I'm going to leave a link at the end of this video that'll click on my top 10 fantasy stories. And in that video, I'm actually wearing a smoking jacket from the 1970s, so that'll be something unique for you. And in the meantime, of course, as we always send you out, here's your fortune.